Welcome to this video lecture from APUS History. And today we're going to talk about something that, let's be honest, is a pretty difficult and controversial topic to talk about. And that is Atlantic slavery. In my viewpoint, I think a lot of people's viewpoints, it is so important that we face our history, whether it's our positive history or in this case, our much darker history. Why? Why should we do this? Why not just be celebratory and move on to something else, right? Because we can't know where we're going to be going if we don't know where we came from. It is so important that we grapple with what happened in the past. And we really have to ask the question, why did this happen? And in the case of Atlantic slavery, it really is very important. I know that today there's a huge debate that's going on about the question about whether or not our society was inherently based upon slavery and racism. In my viewpoint, it was, but not in the way you might think. When I say it's inherently, I don't mean that everything that was done was based upon race and racism. Rather, I would suggest that you should look on it as sort of like a tree. Think of it, any big tree we have has roots, right? And there are numerous different roots to that tree. United States history and European history has many amazing roots, but one of our strongest roots to that tree was racism and slavery, because it was a huge part of who we are. In fact, one of the big misunderstandings about slavery is the belief that it was just a Southern thing and really had nothing to do with the rest of the country. I'm going to try and make an argument that it was a lot bigger than that. And so my thesis and what I want you to consider is that yes, slavery and racism were inherent to Western civilization and American society. But that doesn't mean that everything in our society is corrupted by racism and slavery. There were many great ideas and great contributions. Rather, think of it as much more as the root to the tree, something that spanned 3 different continents, had a huge impact on our economy, and led to massive representations of people as objects, not human beings. So then let's start off with slavery just as a whole, as its origins, because it's really important to talk about this. Slavery as its origins, meaning everywhere, has really been a part of every major society in global history. Slavery goes all the way back, both in the eastern part of the world as well as the west. But slavery in most parts of the world started off as basically for prisoners of war and for indebtedness. People oftentimes sold themselves into slavery in order to pay off their debts. One of the biggest slave trade routes that ever took place was actually northern Africa. It was called the trans-Saharan slave route. It went from Western Africa all the way over into the Middle East. And it actually was there much longer than the Atlantic slave trade was, and more people were sold on the transatlantic slave trade. I would suggest, though, that there's a very unique aspect to European slavery that we're going to go over in just a minute. Okay, so how did European slavery actually get started? So actually, for thousands upon thousands of years, as you know from studying AP World History, Europe and Africa interacted on a regular basis. In fact, the great African kingdoms of North Africa and Western Africa oftentimes traded with Europeans through things like the Trans-Saharan trade route and the Silk Roads. For example, Western Africa, you might remember, had the great kingdom of Mali, which traded rather regularly with Europeans. Europeans actually had a huge amount of respect and admiration for Africans. How do we know this? Take, for example, Shakespeare's play Othello. Othello, who is the key tragic character within that play, is thought to be from Northern Africa. And he's described in glowing terms by Shakespeare. He's even the tragic character in the story. He's not the evil villain. He's the one who's actually put into the situation by the evil villain. It was rather regular that Europeans saw Africans on a very high rate. What changed with all this? So the big change that takes place is the new economic system in Europe called mercantilism. Mercantilism, as you might remember from AP World History, was when Europeans started to seek out colonies for raw resources so that they could use those raw resources to make finished products. The problem was it took a lot of labor for a lot of those raw resources, probably the most important being sugarcane in the Caribbean as well as within Brazil. So where are you going to get that labor from? Well, one of the places that they could get the labor from was from Native Americans within places like North America, Central America, and South America. The problem was Native Americans tended to die a lot more easily because their immune systems didn't react well to European diseases. Also, Native Americans knew the land really well, so they could run away and escape from Europeans. So Europeans started to look for less troublesome labor. And what they found was that they could take Africans from Western Africa and transport them over to places like the Caribbean and to Brazil. Now, a lot of people bring up, didn't the African kingdoms participate in this trade? Yeah, they did. But what is oftentimes forgotten about that is the European incentives for Africans to do this. So the claim is oftentimes made, well, Africans sold their own people into slavery. That's not really true. Think of it like this. If I were to say when the British fought the French in a lot of wars, hey, Europeans are killing each other, why would they do that? You would look at me and say, because some are British, some are French, right? Same is true in Africa. In Africa, not everybody was African. They were part of different kingdoms or tribes or regions. And the Europeans knew this. They played these kingdoms off of each other. They played the kingdoms off of the tribes. They offered, if kingdoms would sell slaves, to give them in reward guns so that they could go out and conquer more areas. In other words, it's very much played into the way the globe was working at this time, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Europeans would buy African slaves from these local African kingdoms on the West Coast. They then transported them to places like the Caribbean or Brazil in something known as the Middle Passage. Now, for most African-American scholars today, this is known as the African diaspora, and in some cases, the African Holocaust, because during that time period, so many thousands, if not millions, of Africans died from starvation and disease, or even being thrown over boats during this time. This also was known as the Triangle Trade because it included 3 different continents: Europe, Africa, and in the Americas. Now, this is where it's so important to understand the uniqueness of the European slave trade. It is true that all societies held slaves at some point, but slaves in most societies could eventually earn their freedom and move up. In fact, in most places like the trans-Saharan slave trade, people oftentimes served as servants inside of people's homes and eventually became free and would become military leaders within these societies, but not in the European form of slave trade. In the European form of slave trade, people became property. This became so important because as people were transformed into property, that meant their children and their grandchildren remained in slavery. So this really brings up the uniqueness of the North American slave trade route. It's turned out that most slaves actually ended up in Brazil and in the Caribbean. In fact, only 5% ended up in North America. Why? The reason why was Brazil and Caribbean had a climate that was really good for sugarcane production. And that's where most slaves were needed. In North America, eventually what slaves are going to be used for is first tobacco production, and then eventually cotton production. So within those areas, we only have about 5% that are transported. Over time, Africans formed African families, and that led to the reproduction of more and more slaves. And that's why we get a bigger slave population. Now, what most people tend to think is, aha, slavery was a Southern thing, right? No, actually, the first slaves ended up in the New England colonies as servants in people's homes. It was just within the New England colonies, those were the areas where slavery was prohibited first as well. New York's a good example. What today we call Wall Street was actually one of the first places in America where slaves were auctioned off and sold off. North and South were highly interconnected when it came to slavery. Even when northern states eventually got rid of slaves, it doesn't mean they weren't responsible for what was going on with slavery. Why? Because they were buying raw resources from the South. In fact, many insurance companies up in the North would insure boats and slave companies dealing with slaves. This was not just a Southern issue. It was an interconnected issue throughout the entire country. A big part of the reason why our country had economic success in the long run was because slaves produced raw resources that were then used for finished products up in the North. Okay, what are our big takeaways off of this? Slavery obviously is one of the most tragic parts of American history, but not tragic in the sense that it happened long ago. We really just need to move on, right? No. Slavery is very much a part of that tree that I talked about, one of the roots, and it has an influence on so many of the things, if not most of the things we talk about within this class. Let me give you an example. One of the great heroes of American society, although he wasn't really in America, was a man named John Locke. John Locke established the idea of natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. This became the foundation of our beliefs in the American Revolution. But here's the connection to slavery. At one point, John Locke was asked, should we free African slaves? And he said, yeah, we should. We're violating their rights. I said, great. then we should do it now, right? He said, no, we can't, because they're property. And being property, we can't take them away from their property owners. Now, to us today, that sounds insane. The whole reason why they were put into property was due to economics and racism, right? But at the time, this became an inherent part of the mindset. Because they're property, we can't free them. Now, how then do you justify the fact that you're holding people as property? Well, maybe we need to make the argument they're not really people, right? And that's why racism becomes a representation that becomes central to so many of the things that Americans think about. We've got to grapple with this if we're going to understand where we came from and why we have the impacts that we do today. Okay, see you in class.